Hey everyone, thank you for joining today. I'm really excited to be hosting our conversation, Product and UX Best Practices for Startups. Startups usually have lean, small teams where they might not have expertise in product and user experience. This panel will discuss techniques and methods to design your product or service with users in mind to drive engagement and usability. So first off, I will quickly introduce our panels, starting with Alexis. Alexis, she and they pronouns, is a queer Chicanx femme from Southern California. Currently a senior accessibility designer at GitHub, she develops educational ecosystems for product folks and integrates accessibility best practices into the product development lifecycle. Previously, Alexis took on the first or only designer roles at Splunk, kickstarting the company's digital accessibility program, and Sysdig, a microservices startup. Welcome, Alexis.
Thank you for having me, Irene. So excited to talk to everyone about the things we're going to dive into today.
Awesome. And next, we'll introduce our second panelist, Christopher Lee, he, him pronouns from Barry Dunn. Chris is a product coach with Agile, DevOps, product management, and line management experience at Fortune 500s and venture-backed startups. He's experienced with technology consulting, user experience, interface aesthetics, and building products that provide exceptional experience and value to users. Chris is based in San Jose, California, and previously served with Ernst & Young's Technology Consulting Accessibilities Committee. Welcome, Chris.
It's good to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
And introducing our last panelist, Dee Miller, she, her pronouns from Visa. Dr. D is the Director of Inclusive Design and Product Equity at Visa, where she leads global strategy for ensuring economic inclusivity in Visa's product and services. She provides subject matter expertise through consulting and training on equity-centered best practices with the goal of increasing access to financial products and solutions in underinvested communities. Dr. D is an engineer by trade with experience in product strategy, user experience, community-based design, design thinking, and systems engineering. And she's based in Austin, Texas. Howdy.
Hi, everyone. And just so I want to be accessible to those that may be visually impaired or not able to see, I am a Black woman, dark skin, cisgender with purple black locks. I have a gray t-shirt on and I'm sitting in a room in a focus room in Austin, Texas. So hi, everyone.
Yeah, and welcome to all of our audience. Feel free to share your product or design backgrounds in the session chat, and you can drop down any questions and we'll try to answer them during our panel as well. So to kick off this panel, we've heard your official bios, but would love to hear a little bit about the journey of how you got started in product UX and or accessibility. So let's start with our first introduced panelist, Alexis.
So I feel like I've changed careers about 4 times since graduating undergrad. I started with an industrial design major and theater minor, and I ended up in kids' toy design. I had an internship, turns out was not sustainable to living in the Bay Area. So I ended up doing a bunch of odd jobs until I found user research, which then went into digital design. I was a product designer for about 4 to 5 years. And during that time, I was giving talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion in tech. Some of my background, I'm a first generation high school and college grad on both sides of my family. I identify as queer. I am Mexican American. So a lot of tech environments usually underestimate and undervalue me. And so it was really important to be that representation and to make sure that folks know, yes, we are here, we're doing great things. And through that, one day while working at Splunk, my head of design pulled me into a room. And after assuring me that I wasn't going to be fired, is always the case, he asked me the question, how would you like to work on diversity and inclusion beyond race, gender, and sexual orientation? And he had started an accessibility program at his prior company he was at and wanted to do the same and thought that I was a really great candidate. So in February 2020, I started my accessibility design career. What a strange time, because the month after we all went into lockdown. But I've been doing it for 3 years, which feels strange and like no time has passed simultaneously. And it's been wonderful to be able to align my passion into a career is such a gift.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that background. Chris, do you want to go next?
Sure. I started my career in software engineering, and at the company I was at, an opportunity was presented to me to be an associate product manager, and I jumped right in, not knowing what product management was. But what I learned is that I really enjoyed it. It was highly interdisciplinary, had a lot of impact on the customers and users' lives, and I I I felt like I didn't really fit anywhere else in the company, so this was a good fit for me. So this was more of an unintentional career pivot. And then so that was in 2011. And then in 2017 I made another unintentional career pivot into product coaching. I saw this position on Indeed that I was applying for. I didn't know it was a product coach role, and then that's when I pivoted into product coaching, which was it's a little bit less of the practitioner work and helping to guide others uh, through a more supportive type of leadership style into becoming product leaders themselves. So I've really found that I've enjoyed that as well. And hi to everyone in the chat from New York City. I live in San Jose, but I was born and raised in New York City.
Thank you. Thanks for giving us a little bit more background, Chris. And last but not least, Dee, you want to introduce yourself and a little bit about your journey from engineering to being able to work in inclusive products?
Yeah, thanks. I started engineering from the perspective of I'm a lefty, so I've always felt left out. As an engineer, I was in my undergrad. I particularly took a look at product design and innovation, and really thought about how can I make this better for lefties. Everything we were doing, and so that is where I started doing mechanical engineering. Looking at it from a societal perspective, things of that nature. Coming out of school, I actually went into public policy first, focused on engineering education. After my experience, I wanted to improve that too. But then I had a grandmother who was sick, had diabetes, and I noticed she wasn't able to use the medical devices very accurately, didn't understand the information, and that to human factors and engineering, and led me to more into UX research. As I built my career as a UX researcher and design strategist, I then decided to pivot kind of, sort of, into product because I really wanted to get the business side of things. So I knew I had the engineering background. I was already working in UX, and I was like, hey, let me do this business side. Let me move over into product management. Well, 2020 happened. George Floyd situation happened. We had a racial justice initiative here at Visa. I was on that group. I focused on inclusive design and processes, and we saw an opportunity from there to go beyond what we had already. So we have amazing accessibility team at Visa, but we saw that there was a need from a financial perspective to start looking at the needs beyond the identity of accessibility and the intersectionalities of these identities. And so this is how I landed this role and driving the strategy of bringing in more customers from the perspective of product inclusion and equity.
Thank you. Yeah, well, to kick off, in terms of actually talking about how startups can ensure their products are user-friendly and intuitive, I mean, how can startups, with these very small teams, get feedback from users on their products without having dedicated UX staff? Chris, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, it's not an easy question. So when you're in a situation where you have a limited budget to hire UX talent, there are a few angles to look at it. Number one is in startups, you have to sort of wear multiple hats. And one angle to look at it is a do-it-yourself solution. Another angle to look at it is a hiring a vendor. So I'm first going to cover the do-it-yourself solution. So there are, you can do your own user research or usability testing. There's a very good book called Rocket Surgery Made Easy that teaches you how to write out your usability scripts. Tomer Sharon put out a book that rainbow colored spreadsheet that allows you to color code sort of the responses and the behaviors and pattern match. And then there's this other concept called jobs to be done. And there's a book on jobs to be done, a free book. I'm forgetting the author's name. I think it's Klein is his last name. And it teaches, and if you Google jobs to be done interviewing, it gives you a script on how to do customer interviewing. Getting out of the building is the most important in order to understand more about your customer. Other option is hire a vendor. A lot of corporations and startups use, I don't work for usertesting.com. I don't get any money out of it, but it's a very valuable tool. There's also a free trial. Thank you.
Yeah, Alexis, do you want to provide some of your thoughts on how small organizations without dedicated UX staff can incorporate, user-friendly designs or ways to think about the user perspective?
Yeah, and this is going to be no surprise of my answer, but folks can start thinking about accessibility early on, particularly when we think about how startups are made. They're often very monoculture and very related to what our society reflects, which is folks who are able-bodied, folks who come from educational backgrounds, folks who, are more white than non-white. And oftentimes we say, oh, well, we are our users, and therefore whatever you don't have in your startup, you're intentionally excluding from users. And our world is so intersectional and international that we can't think that way anymore. Like, to me, that's a very antiquated way of thinking. And so one thing that I've seen in my own experience and in talking with friends who are in startups is when we think about user-friendly or intuitive, we often leave out accessibility because either we're able-bodied, it's not our experience, maybe perhaps we've never seen someone use assistive technology. And that goes back again to our societal roots of like, what does ableism look like? Oh, well, you don't look disabled, therefore you're not disabled. And it involves us unpacking some of these things. So, when you are thinking about developing user-friendly or intuitive products, regardless of whether you have UX staff or not, everyone is responsible at your company for advocating for accessibility. If it's a PM, you're building time into sprints to consider that. You are actively looking to test with disabled users. If you're an engineer, you're adding that accessibility requirements to your design system, to your code. And so some questions that I have for you all is, great, you've got this really awesome, dense data visualization complex experience. How does someone with a cognitive impairment or anxiety or ADHD handle that experience? Maybe they automatically leave your site because it's just too overwhelming. If you're in a place that does things revolving finances, right? How does a colorblind person look at your app if they're red-green colorblind, especially? And if you have a lot of clicks, we often think about metrics, right? In terms of how fast can I get there? Less clicks, less clicks. Well, what if someone can't use a mouse and they're a keyboard only user? What does that experience look like? And even your metric is leaving that person out. So accessibility can really be a game changer for startups. And I hope that we start incorporating some of those principles into product development life cycles.
Yeah. T, you want to give your perspective on this one as well?
Yeah. So plus one to what everyone has said already. I would like to add for the accessibility, Visa actually has an open source accessibility, global accessibility requirements. So you can go there and see test cases, scripts, things of that nature, and access that. To plug that right now immediately after Alexis, because I totally agree with that. From a, I'm going to just be a little more practical here of just like, user testing, totally agree. Is a great, there's UW Tweak also that has like free, able to do, I think when we think about bringing users in, there's a technique to it, right? And so it's really critical and important for us to like, think about it in a way that you're not the user. I think that is the whole point. Like sometimes startups, founders, anyone that works for a company, they forget that sometimes that you're not the user. Take a step back, really think about what does that really mean, and start asking those type of questions. And so, from a low effort perspective, I often work with people and say start with guerrilla usability testing to validate or invalidate assumptions. So what does that look like? That's going up to a coffee shop, going out to the park, going to places where your users are, and actually saying and asking them, hey, or letting them know that you're building something, you want their immediate feedback. That can be scary, but trust me, a lot of people like to share their opinions. And so, it's actually a really good one. In that same context, another is just observing, really understanding your problem space, going to the areas where your users are and really thinking about, let me just how they're doing, taking those observations and thinking about what you're trying to solve for. From an inclusive design perspective, I think it's critical to acknowledge exclusion. And so I often we've created this thing called practicing self-awareness, where we acknowledge our biases, and it's an exercise on our projects for us to acknowledge our biases based off of our own identities, and then ask who's not at the table. I think from an inclusion perspective, also, something that I've noticed is people get very overwhelmed because there are so many identities and intersectionalities of these identities. And so I often extend to many from an inclusive design principle, which Kate Holmes talks about in her book. And what that really means is just like taking that niche or sub segment group and solving for that problem in itself. And then by doing that, you can test with the larger group, because if you're solving to Alexis' point of accessibility, oftentimes you're addressing many things. Earlier, when I said, hey, let me do my self description, or if you think about captions, it was done for one particular user group, but it's like what they call like a curbside effect, where it actually works for people who are in the airport and I can't hear and I can read captions now, things of that nature. So it stretches your mind. So I often say, hey, go after a smaller segment within the group, who within your larger group. For example, for the LGBTQ community, I often say, how does this work from a transgender perspective? What does this look like, right? They're often the group that's excluded within the group, larger group. So let's look at that. I'll start there. I'll start adding as I go and doing research iteratively. My thing that I think all startups need to do is start as early as possible. And I know earlier Christopher talked about time and budget, but as early and as simple and as free as possible as you can do, doing that research and starting it early will save you a lot of time and costs at the end.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for all those great gems. Other things that I'm kind of curious is, what are some industry trends you're noticing in terms of product and UX design or accessibility? Alexis, you want to start this one?
Sure. I'm personally excited because I'm seeing a lot more designers, engineers, and product folks in general talk about accessibility. Dee mentioned earlier about starting early, like in the accessibility community, we call that shifting left. So instead of accessibility being done at QA right before you're just about to launch something and you discover this massive bug and you're at a crossroads of like, do I ship something that's inaccessible? And, if we think about it from a security perspective, very vulnerable, and depending on what industry you're in, that's huge. Or do we not release it just yet and actually fix the bug? By shifting left, we're able and bringing that into user research design. There was a study that was recently done by US Bank and DQ, an accessibility consultant firm, that showed that 67% of accessibility issues can be found in the design phase. Like, I can't stress that enough. That is huge, like 2/3, right? So seeing designers, hearing designers, engineers, and like just people who want to know some of the best tips and tricks. And like, you don't have to be an expert or like, I don't like the term subject matter expert. I think, folks have lived experience regardless of what academia you did or didn't do. Like, you can contribute something to accessibility. And also, especially in my conversations with engineers, like, it's very common at a startup that there's maybe no design resources, but engineers are picking up, okay, maybe I shouldn't slap an ARIA label on every single component and use semantic HTML instead, because that's actually going to get me more bang for my buck and a more consistently operable, understandable component each time. So that, something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, and if anybody has anything, you can feel free. Any of the audience members want to drop things into the comments, feel free. Or if you have questions as we go along. Next, Chris, you want to try to answer some trends you're noticing in the industry lately?
The use of generative AI, such as ChatGPT and Bard, to write product strategy, product vision, and user stories. But these models, they're not entirely accurate, so they make mistakes, so you have to supervise them. And also they're missing your context, so you have to feed it your context. So it's being used almost as an assistive technology to help support the work.
Thanks. And Dee, you want to share some trends you've been noticing as well?
Yeah, I think just from my role, my area is niche. It's been expanded to product inclusion and equity. And so I'm seeing more companies actually hire teams that's focused on that. So a lot of companies have started to develop accessibility teams within this whole umbrella of product inclusion and equity, and really taking a look at a fuller range and intersectionality of human uniqueness and diversity of perspectives, abilities, and backgrounds. And so I'm seeing that a lot. I'm also seeing more use of design systems. I can't express enough of how that is really helpful, and even more exciting how the design systems are really driving consistency, accessibility, and inclusion. And then what I'm seeing just, as the world embraces technology, that mobile first experience is becoming important. I remember there was a time where everybody was just designing for desktops and things of that nature. And then they would say, oh, let's make it responsive. And responsive and mobile are not the same. And so I'm seeing more and more apps being developed from a mobile first perspective, more virtual and mixed reality. And ultimately, I'm seeing the rise of a conscious user. I saw in the comments about bringing more and more of the community into the fold of the design and development process. Yes, I'm seeing more of co-creation, co-designing, and really taking into consideration that consumers desire to align themselves with brands and companies and products that share that social, political, and moral values. And so there's a rise even in sustainability and how embedding that into design as well that I'm seeing.
Yeah. And then in terms of kind of advice in general, I feel like a lot of the audience members are probably founders, or they're just beginning to incorporate user experience in their product design or engineering processes, what are some pieces of advice you could give them for someone who's just starting out, just starting to think about it from this perspective? Maybe this is kind of their first panel that they're attending on this topic. What's some advice you would give to startups who are just beginning this process?
Yeah, so I think one of the important phases that is often skipped in product design and development that I think is really critical from a user experience is making sure you're defining the communities of interest or your target audience appropriately, and obtaining the understanding of the challenge or context in which you're solving for and framing the problem correctly. From what I've seen in working with startups, and earlier I didn't say in my introduction, I also work within Visa and our inclusive client partnerships, which is our fintech startups and entrepreneurs, is that sometimes the problem isn't defined correctly and they haven't really scoped and defined the target audience. And so it is a product that actually isn't solving for the issue that you thought as well. And so I've just recommended a lot of times simple desk research, understanding what has already been done in that space, looking at your competitors. Often you look at your direct. I would say look at your indirect. I remember working at a healthcare company and we were talking about delivery of medication. Well, yeah, we could look at our other competitors in the healthcare company from a delivery perspective, but I was looking at how's FedEx doing it, how's UPS doing it, how's Amazon doing it, because that is what's going to resonate from an experience perspective, and understanding those things. You don't have to use all those methods, but I think those are really like critical in thinking about from the discovery phase, really focusing and understanding who your user is. That will help drive ultimately your product strategy, your research goals, what you need further information on. And so that is where I think we can do, if you're starting out, is where you can start from. I also would like to recommend, earlier I know we talked about vendors, but one thing from a starter, if you can build a relationship with the university, you can also leverage that relationship to help you in conducting research through the classes that's offered in computer science and human computer interaction, engineering things. They're always looking for companies to partner with for the students to practice some of their skills. So that's another way.
Awesome. Chris or Alexis, do you want to add on to this in terms of, I know, advice for people who are just beginning to incorporate user experience into their engineering process?
Yeah, I really agree with what all of Dee had to say. I love how she was saying it's very important to make sure you are framing the problem correctly. And maybe a complement to that is also writing good hypotheses. ThoughtWorks has a very good framework for hypothesis-driven development on writing good hypotheses. Um, Also, I wanted to share that starting off small and making small product improvements through your work from your user research and your interviews. Um, for example, as simple as improving your search filters on your product, running an experiment on that. If it's an early stage startup, then qualitative is more important. If it's a more mature stage startup, quantitative and therefore product analytics important. And trying to have a very clear product vision, which is aligned with your mission and strategy, and then prioritizing which experiments are most important in terms of impact. One other thing I wanted to share is if at all possible, having your engineers sitting in on at least one user test, so they'll understand what is the value behind these problems and these features that they're building more empathy for the user.
Mine's short and sweet. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And I say that because in theory, that's everyone's probably like, wow, really revolutionary. And it is much harder to do that in practice than it is in theory. The number of startups that I have encountered or heard from friends or folks, when things have just imploded, is typically because there is a crossroads. Someone decides either because of knowledge they don't know, of ego, of sunk cost fallacy, which is, well, we're already on this path and we've spent X amount of money and Y amount of hours. So we're just going to continue going down this path, even if we have a hunch that it's not the right thing. Instead of saying, hey, we went in probably not the best direction. This looks like a more viable option. Let's go here. And it goes back to what we're taught as a society. Like we really don't have perceived space to make mistakes. And especially like in working with folks with accessibility, when people are like, oh my God, I've really messed up this product because I removed the focus ring because I thought it didn't look cool and therefore no keyboard only users know where they are in the product. That's not a true story at all. It's saying, well, I didn't know what I didn't know. And also, how are you reacting to changing? How are you reacting to this pivot? Dee mentioned earlier about conscious users. I think we also have conscious employees in 2023, which I'm really hyped for, because there are a lot of folks in positions of power, whether you're a CEO of a 10,000 person company or a CEO of a 10 person company, where there's a lot of power but no accountability. And the biggest thing that you can do as a leader in your space is to not only have accountability of others, but accountability of yourself in times like these.
Wow, this time flew by. We have about 13 minutes left. We did get an audience question that I saw in the chat, and it's around resources and particularly for desk research. But this is a great time to ask kind of what are some best resources for product managers or UX folks or founders who don't have a UX team? Are there any favorite tools, resources, books, or even educational materials that you've seen for people to learn about product and UX?
Yeah, I have a few. And again, it goes back to, and this is my hot take, to me, the technical skills of a job are the easiest to learn. You can go to a boot camp, you can read articles, you can shadow other folks. I'm more interested in how are you approaching this from your own lived experiences, your biases, because that's how you're going to drive innovation and create something new and innovative. And so some resources that I really like, particularly for content writing, is Conscious Style Guide. Big website with a bunch of different resources addressing inclusive language, biased language. What does it actually mean? The things that are coming out of our mouth, right? I love Vivian Castillo's Humanity Centered. So that's a space particularly for UX professionals to be in a safe space and address their bias, commit to doing the work. From an accessibility perspective, I like the A11Y project, and that's A11Y. That's a numeronym for digital accessibility. There's 11 letters between the A and the Y. And also just finding free accessibility checklist. You don't need to be an expert in accessibility in order to incorporate it into your products and life cycle. Some books that I really recommend. I love The Ethical Sellout by Lily Zhang, Maintaining Your Integrity in the Age of Compromise. I know a lot of folks from traditionally marginalized backgrounds often have guilt and shame working in tech and startups because it's just so different. And so I'm really happy that Lily and being as the co-author on this, decided to kind of address one of the big elephants in the room. For engineers who are interested in accessibility, Hayden Pickering's Inclusive Components is a must read, especially if you don't have UX resources. And then for anyone interested in learning more about inclusive design, inclusive product development, my two must-haves are Demystifying Disability by Emily Ladau and Disability Visibility, which has been edited by Alice Wong.
I was trying to follow along and post some of them in the chat, but it was going too fast for me.
Yeah, while other panelists are talking, I can go ahead and write this out.
I put some of them in the chat. Chris, you want to go next?
Yes. So I would recommend inspired by Marty Kagan, the Design Sprint, and then the Jobs to Be Done book I referenced earlier by Alan Clement, and the Rocket Surgery Made Easy, as well as a few products, Figma, Sketch, and InVision, the classics. Thanks.
Awesome. And Dee, what are some resources you'd love to share with the audience?
Yeah, so from a tools perspective, +1 on Figma, FigJam, Mural. From a startup perspective, I would, even from creating wireframes and things of that perspective, I'm thinking of Just in Mind, Balsamiq, Airtable. As I stated earlier, there's this platform called UX. You can do, it's a research platform, and it's pretty much free for smaller projects. So I'm definitely thinking D-Scout is amazing, a qualitative platform, and it also has some great resources. Then from a books perspective, I'm UX Strategy, Product Strategy by Jamie Levy, Customers Know You Suck, Actionable CX Strategies to Better Understand and Attract and Retain Customers by Debbie Levitt. 101 Design Methods, which has a range of different design methods. I would even recommend going to Luma Institute, which has like cards and things of that nature that you can use for like the fly on the wall approach, interviews, participatory research. Jobs to Be Done book, a second book I would recommend. It's a roadmap to customer centered innovation. I believe it's by Stevens, by 3 authors. So let me find out. And then a colleague of mine, Sandra Camacho, who leads Sandra by Design, has started an inclusive design jam academy. And so if you just Google Inclusive Design Jam Academy, it should come up. And she has a how to start inclusive design, great starter document. From a training perspective, Humanity Center, yes. There's Liberation Design, which comes through an organization of like Pause and Effect. And then Nielsen Norman Group would also be a good place to start and look for information as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Hopefully these were helpful. We'll be posting some of these in the chat as well. But I feel like we maybe have time for one more question. We've got about 7 minutes left. I think in terms of like the biggest challenges that startups are facing, would any of you like to answer? Like, what are the biggest challenges that startups face when it comes to product and UX design? Kind of thinking about helping someone with just thinking about the biggest challenges and how they might be able to solve that for startups and founders. Dee, would you like to answer this one?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think one of the hardest challenges is defining that return on investment in design. And the thing is, it's not only hard for startups, it's hard for large companies too. It's hard for everyone. Everyone's always like, what are we getting out of it? But there is some math to this, that if you do the research and start early, incorporating design into the overall process, the cost is like 1 to 10,000 if you wait to the very end. So to Alexis' point of waiting to accessibility at the end, the cost is way more. So I think time and budget are often the things that Christopher talked about earlier that are challenges. The right users, or the lack of understanding of users, of what I talked about earlier in that discovery phase, is often a challenge. One of the major challenges, I think, is just like researching on too many features and just not being able to focus. And then just how to better the lack of understanding of how UX can contribute to startup success. And so I think it's like aligning those business and user needs, better is often a major issue. What I've seen is communication and collaboration between UX and other teams. Often people are like bringing UX in, and I see people saying, make this pretty, make this look good. And it's beyond the look. It's more about the overall experience. So those are the challenges that I've seen. And the way to go about it is, I would even say, one thing that we've discussed even at Visa is, and when I discuss with some of the startups, it's like having a meeting or with other startup founders, right? Having that, because sometimes it's just lonely at the top. And so just having that discussion and seeing how you could collaborate and finding ways and working together. You often learn from each other. Everyone has different lived experiences, to Alexis' point, and when you come together, you can actually come up with a consortium that can help multiple people in addressing this. So those are my challenges that I've seen startups doing. And I think most of the things that we talked about today are ways to address them. One of the things from Tang, you're always trying to find leaner ways and lightweight, but always weigh the costs of going leaner and taking a lightweight approach. The cost is something to keep into consideration. So those are the challenges I've seen.
In the last few minutes, Alexis or Chris, you want to add anything else? Any last pieces of advice or challenges and techniques to kind of possibly overcome those?
I think, especially as a former product UX designer, as a designer, you have to come in being aware of how design is being treated at the company. Are you being respected? Are you being in on the conversations that you need to be on? Or are you just the person who makes it pretty? Or are you just the only person who knows how to use Figma at the company? And knowing when at a certain point you've done all that you can, and maybe it's time for you to go to find an environment that truly supports you. In my case, working at a startup, I was one designer to 12 front-end engineers. And so there was a lot of respect for design, and it was game-changing. An engineer could feel empowered to, try out a design and also run it by me and say I was working on a really deep feature. I had that ability to check it and still keep track of what was going on. So I think, don't stay in a situation where you're not going to be appreciated. Like, everyone has different financial and life situations. And if it's just, you've stayed for a year, 2 years, and design is still not being elevated and an equal partner to PM and engineering, then that's not something for you to fix.
Chris, any last words you want to add?
I would say don't go at it alone. There are some excellent design and product communities that you can join out there. Also, there are design and product mentors that are willing to mentor you for free out there. And take advantage of those, whether in your company or outside of your company, as well as maybe if you have the financial resources to do so, maybe even hiring a coach. Those will go quite a long way.
Okay, we have one last question in the comment. Wondering if we're able to answer any comments on gaming XR, VR environments. Interested in thoughts for design for Apple Vision Pro. Anybody work in the VR space here? If not, no worries. I feel like we are at time. I think we'll probably have to close out the panel now. Notified that it's 1 minute left. So closing out the panel, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really glad to have been able to host this conversation. I really feel like making a product accessible and usable for the most marginalized community will really make the best products for everyone. Working at StartOut sometimes feels like working at a startup. So I think everyone can take away a lot of useful information in terms of having that user-centered approach. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here, people in the comments for asking questions. If there's any resources, we'll put them in the chat, and I believe the sessions are recorded. So if there's something you missed and you weren't able to remember and we didn't put it in the chat in time for you. Don't worry, you'll be able to find a recording afterward. It'll be on the StartOut YouTube page. So thank you everyone so much for joining. It was just a really great conversation. Thank you, Alexis, Dee, and Christopher. I really appreciated that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.